In 2005, I started playing an MMORPG called MapleStory. By modern standards, MapleStory is a bit outdated. It's 2D, it doesn't support a resolution higher than 1080p, and the controls are not the most intuitive at times. Essentially, there are just a lot of features that still scream 2005. Yet, every time I hear the old theme song or see something that reminds me of MapleStory, I have the urge to reinstall it and give it another go. I'm flooded with a sense of nostalgia. The memories of sitting around killing snails and slimes for hours on end as a middle and high schooler. The thoughts of having to call a friend on the phone or Skype because we didn't have Discord. Lazy Saturdays gaming for 12 hours straight. Then I actually log on though, and while the game is still relatively fun, it's not the same as it was 15 years ago. Most things aren't. It no longer takes an entire week to get to level 30 for your first job advancement. You can do that in about 10 minutes now. It's no longer impressive to call my friend over to show him that sick 1000 damage crit I just hit because my character does so much damage that I don't even consciously process how much it is anymore. People don't group up for content and instead mostly play solo, only occasionally stopping to say hi to a passerby. The game has changed, as most things do with time, and as I sit here thinking back to how the game used to be, the question of, was all this change worth it, pops into my head. A question that appears not only when thinking about old MMOs for most people, but for many experiences that happened earlier in our lives. Were things better back then, or are my retrospective glasses clouded by nostalgia? Has the thing I used to love changed, or have I changed? Well, today, we're going to look at the psychology of nostalgia. Before we can start talking about how we experience nostalgia, we need to understand what it is and how it's defined. The American Psychological Association dictionary website defines nostalgia as a longing to return to an earlier period or condition of life, recalled as being better than the present in some way. The key aspect to note here is that nostalgia inherently has a positive component to it. For example, if someone experiences a traumatic event and has flashbacks related to that event in the past, that is not nostalgia. Even a neutral remembrance of the past is not really nostalgia either. In the early 2000s, dozens of MMORPGs were released, and while some of them, like MapleStory, have a nostalgic place in my mind, most of them fall into the meh category of being fairly forgettable. Surprisingly though, this definition is in conflict with nostalgia's historical roots, to which we can reference the story of Odysseus and the Odyssey. Full well I acknowledge, prudent Penelope cannot compare with your stature or beauty, for she is only a mortal, and you are immortal and ageless. Nevertheless, it is she whom I daily desire and pine for. Therefore, I long for my home, and to see the day of returning. Return was continuously on Odysseus' mind, and the Greek word for it is nostos. His burning wish for nostos afflicted unbearable suffering on Odysseus, and the Greek word for it is algos. Nostalgia, then, is the psychological suffering caused by unrelenting yearning to return to one's homeland. This is a representation of how the concept of nostalgia has evolved over time. In the early 1900s and even earlier, nostalgia was seen as a medical disease, one that affected the actual brain. By the late 20th century, this had changed to be a psychiatric disorder, more psychological in nature. At some point in the later half of the 1900s, these descriptions were largely abandoned, and a clear distinction was made between nostalgia, a mostly positive remembrance or longing for what is past, and homesickness or yearning, the often negative feeling associated with the desire to return to something which does still exist. You may have nostalgia for playing Pokemon Yellow on the Game Boy Color as a kid, but as you are at work wishing you could go home and play Elden Ring, you are experiencing a yearning desire that is different in nature. The feeling is not retrospective, it's prospective. The debate over the nature of the feeling of nostalgia isn't so easily decided though. Think about this. When you are experiencing nostalgia, is it often a positive experience, such as remembering staying up late hiding under the covers to play your PSP? A negative experience, like you feeling sad that you can't stay up all night playing your PSP because you have work in the morning? Or a bittersweet experience, a mixture of the two where you feel both happiness and sadness in response to fond memories? Various psychological theorists have proposed different perspectives and thoughts on the nature of nostalgia, but the general consensus seems to be that nostalgia is a largely positive emotion with an aspect of bittersweetness to it. This further separates nostalgia from negative reflections towards the past by specifically recognizing that things we feel nostalgic towards are held in a higher regard. So now we have a basic working definition for nostalgia. Great, but how does nostalgia work? What is happening in our minds when we engage in the process of nostalgia? Is it conscious? Unconscious? Can we choose to be nostalgic? You can find various interpretations of how nostalgia functions, but today we're going to work with explanations from the same publication we have been using, as a means to have consolidated and consistent definitions. So, to answer the question of if we choose to be nostalgic, yes, but also no. It's both. Nostalgia functions in two primary ways, passive and deliberate, or active. Passive nostalgia is when you are watching YouTube and the theme song for Halo appears in the video, and suddenly your mind is back in high school, having a LAN party with the boys. It is an automatic process, one that triggers without any active mental effort. This is the style of nostalgia that we don't have much control over, and is the more common style of nostalgia. It's also the brain's way of saying, hey, This thing you are experiencing now is a lot like this very positive experience you had in the past. Maybe you should do more of whatever it is you are doing. It essentially exists as an automatic incentive to get you to engage in something that you already know you will most likely enjoy, or to avoid things you won't.
Meow?
But we'll get back to that soon. For now, let's talk about the other form of nostalgia, active nostalgia. Active nostalgia is when we purposefully reflect or think back to a time or event in our life that brings us the positive feelings associated with nostalgia. Maybe you're having a bad day, so you boot up your favorite retro game to re-experience the feelings you had when first discovering it.
I call it the memory zone. It's where I've been storing all my favorite memories so I can relive the peak experiences of my life whenever I want.
Choosing to engage in nostalgia differs in that the process is not automatic. We might choose to reflect on nostalgic experiences after an automatic feeling of nostalgia, but it is not a prerequisite. Both forms of nostalgia play an important role in psychological functioning and well-being. Nostalgia exists as a feeling to regulate our moods in times of distress, or even to allow us to reflect on the meaning of our own lives. Whether we are in a bad place mentally or just not feeling ourselves, engaging in nostalgia can allow us to re-experience positive or uplifting moments in our life, which can give us reaffirmation that life can be good, even if it may not seem like it right now. Fun fact time. I asked my community in a poll how frequently they experience nostalgia, and decided to run basic descriptive statistics on the poll. At the time I pulled the data for the poll, out of 808 respondents, the average frequency for nostalgia was at the 39th percentile, meaning that the average person watching this video probably experiences nostalgia occasionally, but not too often. People who experience nostalgia very frequently were less common. Nostalgia, even if it is a generally positive emotion, still has potential downsides though. The major one being when everything viewed through the lens of nostalgia just seems so much better than everything now, preventing us from seeing things accurately and without bias. Oh, for example, I remember how great it was playing Halo 3 in high school and how terrible the new game.
Can't let you do that.
Nostalgia, at its best, can bring us back to a time in our lives that we fondly remember, giving us a positive surge of emotions and a feeling of security in our life decisions that led us to where we are now. At its worst, though, it can blind us to the enjoyable qualities of our current day lives by constantly comparing how things are to how they used to be, by viewing things through a colored lens that doesn't always reflect reality. This is also known as the rose-tinted glasses effect, or specifically when discussing nostalgia, rosy retrospection. This is a phenomenon that dates back farther than you might imagine. The Romans occasionally referred to this phenomenon with the Latin phrase memoria praeteritorum bonorum, which translates into English roughly as, the past is always well remembered. While rosy retrospection and nostalgia are similar, the difference between the terms is that rosy retrospection can be understood as a cognitive bias, whereas the broader phenomenon of nostalgia is just the positive feeling associated with fond memories. Essentially, the two are connected, but you can have nostalgia without also having rosy retrospection. Rosy retrospection bias can be seen in something like game reviews, in that reviewers are more likely to give a higher score to an experience when they are reflecting on it retrospectively as compared to when they are experiencing it directly in the moment. The results of all three studies supported the hypothesis that people's expectations of personal events are more positive than their actual experience during the event itself, and their subsequent recollection of that event is more positive than the actual experience. Essentially, initial excitement towards something boosts our mood to levels and expectations that are hard to realistically achieve. Then we experience something, and even if it is good, it may not be the perfect image we have built in our mind. Then after time has passed, we tend to reflect on only the most positive aspects of such experiences, giving us a bias in our ability to accurately judge the experience. The past is always well remembered.
I remember hating it back then, but time does put a rosy filter on everything. In fact, I dare say I'm actually quite fond of it now.
Rosy retrospection essentially enhances the positive aspects of a prior experience beyond its actual qualities, while lessening or forgetting the neutral or negative ones. Of course, there are exceptions to this. If an experience never had any positive aspects to begin with, you aren't going to be able to retrospectively feel good about it. For example, I struggle to feel nostalgic towards something like Cyberpunk 2077 because the game was so riddled with glitches and issues at release that the bad is in competition with the good. Reflecting back on the game doesn't fill me with a positive feeling. It reminds me of the disappointment that I felt. The real danger of rosy retrospection is when we are unable to detach ourselves from our biases, when we are unable to enjoy new things because they don't meet a previous standard of some kind. Have you ever had a game or movie series that you really enjoyed that either just kept releasing sequels or had a remake that attempted to recapture the original feeling, only to fall flat? For me, a clear example comes to mind: the Star Fox video games. When I was 5 years old, I played Star Fox 64 for the first time. It was an experience that blew me away, and even to this day, I boot it up at least once a year for a quick run-through. Iconic characters, sounds, music, levels, and bosses. All around, just a timeless experience in my mind. So imagine my excitement a few years later when Star Fox Adventures was announced, a new Star Fox game. I may not have been old enough at the time to comprehend nostalgia, but anyone who has played Adventures knows it's different from the prior games.
General Scales, Hiko, Kohud, or Taskuki, Eve Dinosaur Planet.
I remember playing through it only to feel confused and disappointed. This is nothing like the Star Fox I remember. Notice specifically that my disappointment was not in the game itself, but in the fact that it was different from my expectations. Rosy Retrospection has a comparison component to it. If I had never played Star Fox 64 and then played Adventures, the only thing I would be able to judge it on would be its own merits as a single game. Now, there is a conversation to be had on the actual quality of a new experience in comparison to an older one, but the point remains that the original experience has a connection to the new one in some form, and therefore the newer experience, which, as we established, is the lowest rated moment in experiences, is compared to the rosy tinted memories of the older experience. This means that we are more likely to judge new experiences more harshly when they are tied to something we hold nostalgia for, even if a new experience is actually good, because the comparison point is the best of the old experience. So how can we overcome the cognitive bias of rosy retrospection? The answer is actually surprisingly simple. Being aware, mindfulness. A large majority of cognitive biases can be overcome by paying active attention to them in situations when they might arise. Have you ever done something subconsciously that you never really noticed? Like maybe breathing really heavily into the mic on Discord, then someone told you you were doing it, so now your mind pays just a little extra attention to not doing that thing? That's exactly how cognitive biases work. Once we understand that they affect everyone at times, we can pay more attention to try to make decisions from a less biased viewpoint. When I first saw Star Fox Zero announced, I thought it was just another attempt to cash in on nostalgia by digging into one of my favorite franchises.
Do a barrel roll!
Like many others, I felt like I was watching something I love go out of control. A runaway train heading towards a bunker of cherished memories like,
No! Give them way! I said, stop it!
I never even gave it a chance. I was burnt out on the series. I didn't think that there could be anything that would actually make me want to play these games again. A few years after its release, though, I decided to look into it again, to give it a shot, and I realized something, that I had been missing the chance to experience something unique and new, that my nostalgia for the older games had led me to shutting out any chances for the series to be fun or enjoyable again. Even if it wasn't exactly the Star Fox 64 that I grew up with, it was still something that I found great joy in, that allowed me to establish new memories, ones that in 10 years I will be able to look back fondly on. The lesson that I would like to leave for you all is that nostalgia can bring us back to our greatest moments. It can allow us to reflect, actively or passively, on the experiences that shaped who we are. It can make us happy in times of stress, and yes, sometimes it can blind us. Nostalgia is both a wonderful memory and a single tear that represents a longing for what is past, a bittersweet representation of all the wonderful experiences that made us who we are today. Most importantly, though, nostalgia can remind us that despite all of the struggles that may exist in our lives, there were times when things were good, and there will be times when they can be again, that you can create new memories to be nostalgic for in the future. Thanks for watching.
We're heading out. All aircraft report.